Hello and welcome to another episode of the Cloud Architects podcast. Today with cyber incident response. But before we run into our show topic, let me hand over to Chris to introduce himself. Hey Chris, great to see you on the show again.
Hello everyone, I'm Chris Goosen. Great to have you here with us again, and we're super excited today because we get to speak to Fran again. Fran is a returning guest on the show, old friend of the show and returning guest. Fran, thank you so much for making the time to join us early in your morning, I think.
Thank you so much for having me. This is always a blast and love speaking with you guys.
Thanks. We like to have fun on the show as well, but sometimes we do try and be somewhat serious, and I think that kind of speaks to a little bit about the idea behind this episode, right? I was listening to, sometimes, and this is probably quite weird, but I can never get used to listening to myself. Like, it's such a weird thing. But occasionally, I listen to our episodes when I'm driving. It's like we go through this production process, after we record, where things get edited and get published and all of that. And I listen to everything. I mean, we all do listen to everything multiple times during that process, but it's weird, like a week or two later, if I find myself kind of tuning into the latest show again, just to kind of listen to it again with fresh ears, if you will. And I was listening to the recent Exchange episode that we did, and one of the things that kind of dawned on me, and you may recall, listeners may recall that I said that in the show, I said that having a head in the sand sort of posture about your security is no longer acceptable, and Nick challenged me on that, and something that kind of dawned on me was, we talk about readiness and cyber readiness all the time on the show, and how it's only a matter of time, before a breach will occur. It's not about if, it's about when, but we've never really sort of dug deeper into what does that mean. What does cyber readiness mean? And when I was thinking about that, of course, my favorite friend Fran, his name popped into my head. I thought, you know what, I'm gonna speak to Fran, and let's see if we can get Fran on the show to come talk to us about sort of cyber readiness and incident response as well, because I think those two things go so well together and hand in hand, right? It's good you have to be ready and anticipate, but I think you also need to know what to do once or if something happens, right? Again, we see the media going crazy all the time now. I mean, here in Australia, it's just bonkers at the moment with some of these breaches and that have been going on, and the funny thing is, like, the fallout from it is like I've never seen before, right? Like I lived in the US for a long time, and I mean, a lot of the stuff that happens in America, it doesn't even make the news, right? Colonial Pipeline, like, maybe that made some of the news outlets, but really, like, the stuff's happening every day, and it doesn't even really make the mainstream media anymore. But over here, one telco gets hacked, and man, it's like on everyone's lips, right? And I mean, they're pushing all these new bills through Parliament, and there's all these new sort of cyber offensive programs now being stood up to hack the hackers, and it's nuts, right? So very topical. But I still think, and I get the sense from a lot of customers, that maybe this isn't something that they think about, right? They think about, well, how do we patch? They think about all that kind of stuff. But what about cyber readiness? So Fran, I guess to kind of kick off, if I'm an organization and I'm thinking, okay, well, how do I know if I'm ready? What are those things potentially that I should be kind of thinking about, whether they're procedural things or professional services or things like that? I mean, where do I even start?
Sure. Yeah, I think the important thing here for most organizations is to work with potentially another organization who has some experience helping organizations across the different industries to actually review their incident response program and actually test it in a scenario. What I would recommend is that you partner with an organization who can help you understand what is my general, like, cyber risk, and what things should I be focusing on in order to be able to respond appropriately. Something that you mentioned a bit earlier prior to recording, Chris, was the concept of a tabletop exercise, which is often very eye-opening to both technical and executive and other leaders within the organization, because it puts you in a scenario where you literally have an incident response expert in a room running you through an exercise about what would you do in this scenario and how would you respond. And often what you see in those tabletop exercises is that a lot of organizations maybe know what they'll do from a technical perspective vaguely, not fully, but they'll kind of understand what to do from a technical perspective, but they're often not ready to engage things like the press or the media. Often we see organizations who have spent significant amounts of time planning on how to do technical incident response, which we should certainly talk about, but not, hey, how do I communicate to my employees about something going bad? What happens if I communicate to my employees and that gets leaked to the press? How are we communicating with the press? Who's communicating with the press? And how are we updating our executive leadership or the board of directors about what's happening? An interesting story that I'll mention, and we can talk a little bit more about the technical aspects after, is often organizations panic and over communicate to board or executive leadership, where when you over communicate things that you're not fully certain about, it kind of creates a lot of chaos. I've seen a lot of scenarios where something bad happens, you have a very technical, security minded person who's kind of thinking about the worst case scenario and communicating that as it happens to somebody in an executive position or the board of directors. And often you don't want to be in a position where you say, well, we thought this is the bad thing that happened. We didn't have enough information at the time to actually confirm that was the case. And it's actually either worse or we're in a better position. So something that I would really recommend that any organization do is partner with a security firm to do a tabletop exercise. Almost every firm will have the capability to deliver this on your behalf. And make sure that you're not just including your technical leadership and your organizational leadership, but folks from marketing, folks from employee communications, folks from investor relations, if you happen to be a public organization, and just run everybody through what would you do in a really terrible scenario, like your Exchange server was breached and maybe now attackers have all of your emails or they've exfiltrated client data. So tabletop is a really valuable point to start with here, Chris.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I actually have been, I guess, somewhat involved in some of those recently, and it is eye opening because you can have all of the DR strategy down, right? You can have all of this like, okay, well, we know we can restore this back up at this time and we can get this much data back, but when you kind of dropped in this malware type scenario potentially, or a sort of some sort of breach situation, it gets interesting, and I like what you said. Like it's not just the technical technical team that need to be involved in this, right? Because sometimes it's the marketing person who kind of looks at things from an angle that you wouldn't consider as a technical person, right? As well, and they ask a question, and you're like, that's the most bizarre thing I've ever that anyone's ever said, but it actually is awesomely applicable to the situation and helps us out. So that's good. So tabletop exercises are sort of a really good way to kind of run through, I guess, any number of different scenarios to try and help kind of simulate where we are with this. You mentioned sort of press and investor relations. I think that's sort of a really important thing. I think at this point in time, like companies, the reputation is kind of hurt significantly, right? And I won't mention names, but there've been some incidents in recent history here where large orgs have had some issues, and their first sort of way they handle it is deny, deny, deny until eventually there's just like, so much irrefutable proof, right? Now, to me, that's not necessarily the type of org I want to be doing business with, right? When deny is the first, or, and so I think it's a very interesting topic of like, make sure that the right people are communicating the right message at the right time, instead of just, okay, well, let's over communicate, or let's, I think that's, technical people definitely can do that, can't they?
Yes. Yes.
So,
Another thing that I've seen, I'm sorry, Chris, I just wanted to mention with this deny, deny, deny thing is um, often organizations have an immense amount of trust in their own visibility and their own capability to have detected something bad happening. So when there is potential press around, hey, somehow user data was leaked or was stolen or is now available on the quote unquote dark web, if organizations haven't seen that before, there's the often kind of objective to just reassure clients that everything seems to be okay. But often what you find is that either you don't have the right visibility and you actually have been breached and you've missed that, or it could be a partner whom you had shared that data with that actually had a business purpose for hosting that data and holding that data. You can't just blanket say, hey, this nothing happened, this is not us, it's fake. I think that's the reaction of a lot of organizations when they haven't seen anything internally to identify that that data may have been leaked, and not something as loud as like a ransomware attack
right,
where every screen across your organization turns black
yeah,
and there's a big ransomware message. Sometimes
yeah,
that doesn't happen. Sometimes it's a partner, sometimes it's a vendor. So I think having the response capabilities internally at the marketing and like kind of press level to say, hey, we are investigating this, and we will communicate with customers at this cadence as we know more. I think that kind of attitude is important. You cannot assume that you're secure just because you didn't get an alert about it, or you didn't see a ransomware pop-up screen, or the bad guys didn't email you.
So, and I think that raises a very interesting sort of question, though, right? Is like, how do I even know that something's gone wrong? Because, like you mentioned, there are so many different types of breaches, even where, if they're doing their job well, the bad actor, they're not alerting you to the fact that they're there, because they want to go and sell that access to someone else, right? So how do I mean, for one, how do I even know? And should my plan include some sort of consensus, right? Like a go, no go, for a change or a project, like some sort of consensus that says, okay, well, if we suspect something, but there are 3 indicators, then we'll communicate. But if we suspect something and there's 1 indicator, then we won't communicate until we find 2 more indicators. Do you know what I mean? Is there some sort of like threshold at which you should actually start taking this like super seriously?
Actually, before Fran answers that, let me throw something in there. And I want to approach this from a doctrinal point of view. And when we talk security doctrine, and the favorite on everyone's lips at the moment is zero trust, which says we assume breach and we guard against, or we attempt to guard against long-running attacks. So that means I have an actor, at least one party, maybe multiple competing parties in my infrastructure, which that was called out to me in a somebody else's retail customer, not mine, where they had 2 sets of attackers actually competing for resources in that customer. So one of them had a shadow DC set up, and the other hacker group was actually trying to compete for that same resource. And this was found out because a security firm said, can we do a POC, and can we just look at some stuff? And they found all these people making changes that no one was aware of. So to come back to my question from my ramble, if we go and look at the premise of I've got long-running attacks in my infrastructure because I'm assuming breach, And Chris, you going down the road of, I think there's something there, right? But if we take a step back and say, well, I'm assuming breach, what do I do if I find this long running attack? And we know that groups like Lapsus have been documented to have not just one vector, but 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, and they'll pull on one of the vectors. And if you close that one off, there's others. So this is kind of like Cold War type stuff, right? Where I'm finding a vector. Does that mean, well, what does it mean? What do I do now? I found a long running attack. I found an actor in my infrastructure. And then that goes on to Chris's question of, well, now I've got multiple things, or maybe I've got a singular thing. So I want to go back and ask the question from the doctrinal point of view. So I believe in zero trust. I assume breach. I assume long-running attack. So I use clever folks like Fran to go and look for these people. Now I find a mole, a rat, a mouse in my infrastructure, whatever the desired term is that doesn't offend someone. What do I do now?
Yeah, I think this is often an area where I've seen a lot of failure. And what I mean by that is there are organizations who don't have well-prepared, tested, simulated attack scenarios like incident response plans, where the answer is immediately to, okay, blow away that system, let's rebuild, let's make sure that whatever systems we think were impacted are segregated from the network. And I think that this is where you need guidance from an expert, be it somebody on your existing staff or truly ideally an external party whose job has been to respond to incident response engagements and respond to attackers. Because often what you'll see is that your actions will tip off the attacker, and they will use that tip off to actually activate contingencies that they likely have. I'll give you a really concrete example from my personal experience. I worked at a company that did attack stuff on behalf of clients to test their security response capabilities. And often we would look for indicators that we have been caught. And before that happened, we would often pre-stage access in a way that's going to be very difficult for the organization to identify. So as an example, depending on the tier of actor that you're responding against, sometimes those threat actors have broken into like your printer and put malware on your printer and made it call back to them one time a month. So that if everything happens to go awry and you try to eradicate as much as possible, in a month or in however long since that last thing checked in, they're going to get access again. So that eradication part is really tough. And often attackers are monitoring how you as an organization are responding. So it's important to have an incident response plan and ideally a partner who can come in and gather as much information as possible about the potential scope of the compromise prior to taking action. Sometime taking that domain controller offline or just turning off all of your network access, which I've seen multiple times, just like turn off the internet, is not the best approach because potentially the scope of the attack is limited. And now you're hurting your business by limiting all internet access and potentially turning off your website. And sometimes that will tip off an attacker to actually retaliate immediately. We have seen that threat actors who are ransomware focused, as soon as they're caught, maybe they didn't accomplish all of their objectives. Maybe they didn't turn off every backup. Maybe they didn't steal all the data that they wanted, but like you caught them, they're gonna go ahead and turn on the ransomware right away to at least cause some damage. So I think it's a really difficult balance between when do I respond and how do I respond? And often what you need to do as a security professional or as an IT professional is understand that you need to have as much information as possible about what has occurred before you take any action. Before you communicate to the press that, oh, actually, yes, we've been breached and all of this data was stolen. Or worse yet, hey, we've been breached and the impact of the breach is this. And then 2 weeks later, where 3 days later, you have to go back and say, hey, just kidding. It wasn't 20% of our client base. It was 100% of our client base, and all of the credit card data is gone. So I think understanding when you have enough information to act is often really hard, because in security or breach situations, organizations tend to overreact, and security people within these organizations tend to just take the most immediate action they can think of that will remedy the problem immediately, even if that will potentially cause more pain for the business down the line. So I think really it's all about knowing when you have enough information to act. And that is often subjective and requires some experience, right? Like, have I ever, as an incident responder, dealt with this attack group before? Do I understand what is their modus operandi? Like, how do they accomplish their objectives? Do I, as an incident responder, understand that? And then I can go look at what I've seen in the past to say, oh yeah, this group typically also stages access on an Exchange server, or will continue to have access via a employee account or something they created in Azure AD. So I think working with a partner who has experience responding to things like this in the past, who has experience understanding when they know that they have enough information, and who ideally also understands how attackers attack is really, really important. To make sure
sounds like
you
a
don't.
really hard problem to solve, Fran.
Yeah, indeed. It's hard to make these calls as an incident responder. But ultimately, what typically happen in these scenarios is that all you're doing is kind of like continuously pulling threads, right? It's like, okay, there's a shadow DC, or somebody's making changes to my Active Directory infrastructure that I've never seen before. Where are they doing that from? How did they get access to the account? Who created the account? When was that created? Where was it created from? And then you get to the last part, and you just kind of work backwards until you have as complete a picture as possible. Like, literally from, hey, this bad thing happened, to how did they even get into our environment in the first place? Where did they move to? Have they set up any persistence mechanisms? So I think that's the really hard part for incident responders. But I will say that the one kind of advantage that we as defenders or blue teamers have is that these attackers often have very established and successful patterns that they will use over and over. I mean, some of these attackers, ransomware operators, they literally have like playbooks for like, what do you do if you're here? And like, how do you find more data? Or like, what's your next step? Because some of these guys are like new hackers that they pulled off the street, or that they hired like 2 weeks ago, and they need them to be effective to steal your data and ransom your organization. So these guys have playbooks. These guys have kind of processes that they follow, just like any organization. And if you're able to kind of discern what that has been in the past, it informs you on how you should act in the future. So that's why also there's a lot of value in working with an incident response organization, because they may have seen exactly this threat actor in the past. They may have seen this attackers. They may know what they're doing. They may know their tooling, and they can use that to help you.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, right? Because I think a lot of folks kind of listening to this might go, well, hang on, like, we have some really smart people, blue teamers on our team, and why would we need to work with a partner? It's exactly that, right? Is your business is making widgets or selling dog food or whatever it is, it's not security research. And yes, you may have those really smart people on the team, but do they have access to that latest bit of research that other folks are just doing? That's what they do, is they research these sort of tactics and how these folks are how operating, and they are able to use that and to, I guess, the advantage of being able to defend, right? So that's a really good point. I think that's definitely worth sort of echoing. Fran, the other thing I wanted to say was just on that as well is you want to make sure, I guess, that you have these agreements and sort of structures in place before you need to use them, right? Because the last thing you want to do is have something sort of go down, and then all of a sudden now you're getting on the phone to, every consulting firm in the in the phone book, or on Google, or what have you, trying to get someone to help you. And professional services is a very interesting game. We've all been there. Like, resourcing and staffing and all of that kind of stuff is difficult, right? And you want to make sure that you, I guess, have some sort of response, timeline and capabilities in place before something actually goes wrong, so that you can get on that pretty quickly, because time really is important.
Yeah, I'll tell you that often what organizations don't consider are the broadly impactful attacks or campaigns where everybody's calling their incident response provider at that time. So think like SolarWinds. SolarWinds was an example of anybody who had SolarWinds was calling us. And when you're a firm looking to respond to like broadly impactful, like worldwide events, we're going to make sure that we're allocating our resources to people whom we have existing like service level agreements with, or response engagement agreements with. And if you call us in the middle of SolarWinds or Log4j or all these other things that are like broadly impactful around the world, it may just be like, sorry, we're on the phone with everybody else who has this thing or who's responding to this thing. And often what you'll find is that almost every firm you call who you can find quickly is going to tell you the same thing. It's like, sorry, we're helping everybody else. We're helping all of our clients who have pre-existing agreements. So I think
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's important to consider the fact that you could be in a position where you are one of hundreds of thousands of organizations who are experiencing the same thing at that very same moment.
I was going to say, I'm reminded also of kind of the chaos that happened with the F5 vulnerability from like a couple years ago, right? And that didn't even just hit sort of incident response companies. That hit anyone who had any F5 resources, and anyone who had any F5 skill was kind of, their phones were ringing off the hook at that point, because how many people used F5? It was kind of crazy. So that's a really good point made. So we talked about kind of readiness and thinking about these things, planning it through tabletop exercises, and just understanding, knowing what to do, who does what, all of those types of things. But we also have been talking about this sort of an incident response, and I guess that term can be kind of loosely interpreted to mean like a few things, right? I mean, it could mean an actual sort of engagement of some sort. It could mean probably a plan or a run book of what to do. What's the best place, sort of fundamental place to start when you're thinking about incident response, Fran? Is it that sort of that run book of here are the things that we want to do if we get to this sort of situation?
Yeah, I think probably the first place that I would start is who's involved and how. So who are you going to call in a war room and make sure that they're available to you? And how are you going to reach them? If it's the middle of the night, if it's a weekend, if it's a holiday, that's kind of the most important, right? So you need to know who's involved in the decision-making and communication process, and who is leading the technical aspects, who's leading the potential PR aspects, who's the business decision maker, who's making decisions about the business rather than just the technical decisions. So I think who is engaged and who's involved is where you should start. That's what you need to do, because you don't want to be in the middle of a incident and trying to figure out like, oh man, who do we call? Who is familiar with what they should communicate or what they shouldn't communicate? Who's going to join this bridge and immediately start messaging everybody on their team like, oh my God, we're hacked. It's the end of the world. Everything is done. Like, those are the types of things that you want to figure out first.
And you probably want to have the sort of I guess the arrangements or the sort of in place, right? Set the right precedents as far as communication of the incident, even internally, right? How much can and should be said and communicated. And I'm thinking about, very often one of the big things that we always recommend whenever I do, some sort of security assessment is a break glass account, right? Or multiple break glass accounts that can't be affected by a federation outage or an MFA outage or something like that, right? We've all seen that happen. But the very next question to that is, well, you've got these break glass accounts. Who has the credentials? Who has the password to that thing, right? Is it in a safe? Well, who has the key to that safe? And it's so funny how, like, you get down the chain and you go, do you have a break glass account? Yes, we do. We have multiple break glass accounts and they're, cloud only account. And then you go, okay, well, where are those credentials kept? Well, I know the password in my head, or it's in my password vault. I'm like, okay, well, can other folks get to that? No. Well, so what happens if you're playing golf or you're, in the Bahamas on some, cruise and your phone doesn't work? Like and so you kind of have to think through all of those points of failure when it comes to some of these things, because, when things really happen, sometimes there isn't time to go and wake the guy up who's in the Bahamas. Like, it's just weird.
Yeah, I think having information about who has access to what data and what tools and what accounts is really critical. In the scenario that you described, having a shared password vault with a set of individuals who have access becomes really, really important, right? So as an example, at the organization I work at, there are 3 people who have access to a break glass account that's in a separate password vault, that's separate from all of our other infrastructure, and we know who those people are. And those people happen to be in different parts of the world in different time zones, so that we're not in a position where everybody's on holiday, everybody's out playing golf. However, I will say that then you have to consider what happens when your password vault is compromised. The unfortunate reality is, if you look at recent breaches, and I'll name it, this is public, Uber had a fairly significant breach by the Lapis gang that you mentioned earlier. And what happened is they broke in and they found administrative credentials to their password vault. Well, guess what? Their password vault had admin access to AWS and Azure and Slack and email and Dropbox and everything. So while I'm a huge fan of like these shared password vault solutions, and they're important and they're necessary, you should also kind of consider what happens when the bad guys have access to every credential that's in my admin shared password vault, and how do you deal with that?
What
how
do you do?
recover? Yeah.
So what do you do?
Yeah, that's a really tough situation. I would say you probably want a segregated, like, identity and access management or privileged access management set of tools that are separate from anything else the organization may be using. I mean, we've all worked in organizations where there's kind of a shared password vault for IT or for the security team or for the operational team. Maybe all of the like break glass accounts shouldn't be just there. Maybe you want a backup where only 2 people in the company have access to this other password vault solution. Maybe the passwords are written down on a piece of paper in a fire safe in the CISO's or the CIO's or the CTO's office. And hopefully the CTO is not the only one with a key and a combination. So I think this is where low tech also comes in very handy, right? Yes. Like you want an account where the only place it's stored is in a fire safe in a really secure location, where if the building burns down and you're dealing with an incident response engagement at the same time, that fire safe is going to survive and you're going to be able to get to that account.
That would be a very bad day if that actually transpired. I was going to ask you about password vaults, and you kind of already alluded to this, right? I think it's pretty common for IT teams or tech teams to have some sort of shared thing, and it varies. Sometimes it's self-hosted, sometimes it's cloud-hosted, etc. What's your experience with like organizations kind of rolling out access to a shared vault to all of their employees? I'd be very curious, and both this be a question to both of you guys, right? Because it's interesting. I'm a big fan of password vaults, and with the caveats that you mentioned, Fran. But I've really only ever seen one company, maybe two, where when you're a new starter on your first day, and you get your mailbox and your email and your Teams account, you also get enrolled into the company password manager solution, and whichever one it is, right? So you have your personal vault that you can store stuff in, but then you also have access to shared vaults where important stuff, departmental stuff, so that these things aren't stored in spreadsheets. I don't think that that's something that I've come across very often. I mean, Nick, what are you seeing with not necessarily your customers, but what are you seeing generally with organizations? Are they adopting things like this?
I see a myriad of things that are out there, and the shared password thing is super popular. I do find that to Fran's example, everyone in IT uses the same vault. They're pretty blasé about it. It's like we have this mechanism. We share the password over text, WhatsApp, Signal, and we don't consider that a mobile phone could be compromised or email could be compromised, and passwords for the vault are freely communicated, and so sometimes I think, why do we bother with this type of thing? And it goes back to one of the things that Fran was saying earlier, which I'm going to infer to as security culture. There's a lack of security culture in organizations where there's not only a lack of cyber incident response or even a thought about it, but unless there's been a breach. And to our last interview where we recorded Sachin, the CISO, he suffered a significant breach, and after that his organization was willing to spend the kind of money it took to actually roll out not only tools but also disciplines and have the kind of accountability thinking that goes with everyone is accountable for security. And using his example, he had to write the speech for the CEO who had to appear on national television. That's a lot of pressure, and that buys you a lot of buy-in from the business around security. I also want to add, just because I can and I'm soapboxing, that often security is an IT problem. It's not a business problem. So it's like, well, that's Fran's problem. He'll fix that. And it's not as an organization, we have the following stance towards security, and we are prepared in the following manner. It's more like a case of, well, we hope nothing ever happens, and it's a line item in our security expenditure. And I see some of my customers are amazingly well prepared. Those are the ones that tend to have the highest risk items. So people with nuclear reactors, and they manufacture things like oil and that type of thing, and they understand what could happen if an attacker would come in and pollute a bay or a valley or an entire human settlement somewhere in a part of the world, and what's the negative impact of a pipeline breach. Others, it's, there's extremes. Well, we hope nothing ever happens is a lot of what I see out there. So I see a mixture of it, Chris. I don't think there's a clear standard.
No, and that's fair, but I also think, so like in my mind, we're not only at risk in a business context, right? When we, our everyday kind of business lives and the way that we operate, but I also feel like we're becoming more and more at risk in our personal lives as well, because we also use technology in our personal lives. And it's interesting. I mean, if you take a look around, like I think us on the call, and Fran, I've known you long enough. I know the type of stuff that how you set up your personal laptops and things like that, right? I know that you're super security conscious. But I think that we've been working in this sort of space for long enough where we're familiar with password vaults and multi-factor auth and all of these things. But I think most Joe average people will only turn on multi-factor on something personal if it's forced, right? If Google or Twitter or whoever forces MFA on your account, then you'll put up with it. You're gonna complain about it every time, but you'll put up with it, right? It's not like something you'd go willingly do. And I think password managers are the same thing. Like I feel like the way we get people to be using password managers more often, and the associated benefits of that, of unique, long, difficult to remember passwords, right? That are for every site that they visit. The way we get people to that point is by giving them the culture of, hey, this is a password manager. You're going to use it in your job every day, and it's going to become second nature to you, so that when you leave the office, you're gonna start doing it. And I'm sure you guys have this, and I'm sure everyone who is listening to this can relate to this problem. You have parents who are now starting to use technology, and you have to remember every single password that they, for their stuff. Like my dad doesn't care about the password. No, he just wants it to work, right? And every time I see him and I look at his device, there's a new email account or a new something. So why do you have 4 email accounts now? Well, I needed this thing and I couldn't remember the password for the other one, so I just used and created a new one. And it's that easy, right? And I, not too long ago, I did something for my mother-in-law. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I was doing something on her phone, and I thought, you know what, like, whenever I need a password, she's got a little notebook and she opens it up and she goes, oh, here, I think it's this one, and she gives me the password. And I think that's pretty common, right?
That's perfect.
Said,
that's actually perfect.
Right.
I'm totally good with that.
And I said, well, I think how about we let's kind of modernize this, right? And I installed Bitwarden on her phone, and I said, well, from now on, like if you need the passwords for things, like for this thing I've set up or that thing I've set up, it's in there. And I showed her how to get into it, and she was like, oh, this is really cool. It's like my little notebook, but on my phone. And I was like, exactly. So, that's what the reason I asked about the password manager thing, right? Because I feel like we'll get there. Folks will start being a little bit more responsible with these things once they become more integrated into their everyday life, and it's not just something that is for the tech people, right? Because I think that's right now that's where everyone sort of sees it.
I think that first of all, I agree. I think that as I'm in the cybersecurity field, and that's been my entire career. I think our job within cybersecurity is to make this stuff so easy that users don't even really have to think about it. What I mean by that is, if you look at some of the work that companies like Apple and Microsoft and even Google have done to integrate this like password management best practice stuff into the core operating system or into their browsers or into whatever, that's a huge step forward for a very, very large percentage of people. So I people in my family, my loved ones, they don't even know that their passwords are all stored in iCloud in the like passwords feature. But guess what? Safari and their phone encourages them to have auto-created passwords that they don't have to remember. And they're encrypted with their face and their password to iCloud, or the same thing with Chrome. I think that's the job of kind of the tech companies, that we need to make it so ubiquitous and easy that ideally users don't even have to think about where this is happening. I also think that, to be frank with you, example with the notebook, my mom does the same thing. And to be honest, that is going to be a much easier thing than ever showing her Bitwarden or how to like even get to passwords on her iPad or what have you. And you have to consider like that our threat model and what we're doing as cybersecurity people or as tech people is going to be different than like your grandparents. And your grandparents having a notebook that's like in a drawer that has all of their passwords, that's okay. Like that's okay. Sure, somebody could break in and now they have access to all their email, but like if somebody breaks in, they're not looking for the notebook with the passwords. They're looking for the TV or the jewelry or what have you. So I think it's just like, that's okay. Having a notebook with your passwords, cool. That's really good. At least they're, separate, and they're likely somewhat unique for a lot of these accounts, and they're
exactly.
somewhere.
Yeah. I think I think hopefully we're starting to make some inroads in the whole like unique passwords for everything you use kind of war, right? I mean, I don't know, excuse me, how commonplace it is yet anymore still, but at least everyone in my circle, I think, understands now the the danger of reusing credentials across things, and not everyone is as paranoid as I am. I guess is the other thing. Although, compared to Fran, I not that you're paranoid, Fran. I don't want to label you as paranoid. I just like I said, I really enjoy kind of watching you do things sometimes because yeah. But again, you have these fascinating stories about printer drivers and all the things, right, that I guess also help kind of inform that behavior. So
I'd like to throw something in there to all the folks listening to the show who are in any way customer facing. And it's because a challenge came to me last week when I was hanging with the Microsoft Cyber Incident Response team. A really clever bunch of people that they're part of DART. They do really interesting things. They ask really hard questions to people with interesting problems in the middle of breach. And one of the folks who does this for a living asked us, and was quite literally a room of us at a Microsoft Security Summit. And you asked us, so who of you is customer facing? And obviously everyone put up their hands in the room. So he said, so how many of you have a separate machine to connect your customer's network with that's hardened and locked down? No one put their hand up. He said, so you're willing to take a breach from one customer to another across your soft, defaulted machine and drag it around with you and expose potentially every customer that you have, and you just don't know. And we thought, wow, that's a bit of a breathtaking scenario. And I'd like to get Fran's input on that, because I see the eyebrows up. I see you nodding in that sageful, meaningful way. So Fran, microphone over to you.
Yeah, I think, look, I think it's kind of unfair to expect people who aren't in cybersecurity to like go through the hassle of having a separate machine per client. I think you have to consider the security implications of that. So like, as an example, where I work, all of the client access goes through segregated jump devices that we control, we manage. We're making sure that like pivoting from one client to another is not possible. But from an incident response perspective, as a like incident response consultant, it's actually normal to have what you call like your battlefield laptop. Like you're literally traveling with like your corporate laptop, and then you're traveling with your battlefield laptop. And that battlefield laptop is what you're plugging into the client environment. That's how you're accessing whatever client tools they have. And guess what? At the end of that battlefield engagement, you're probably imaging the hard drive of that laptop and then wiping it so that the next call you get, you're hopefully not dragging along all that malware. I think that's a fair expectation for like incident response engineers and incident responders. I don't think that's a fair expectation for like a general like IT or cloud consultant. But I think it's something that you have to consider. I think potentially as an organization, if you're doing a lot of consulting and this is a concern, it should be at some level, you need to consider how your users and your employees are accessing client infrastructure and what the risk of that is.
That's fair. Fair comment. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I like that. I mean, and especially, I'm a consultant. I work with different customers in different locations. Now, that said, if I just think back to like my last 3 engagements, right, well, 2 engagements this year, but I've not used the same machine on any of those environments because one customer mandated, the use of one of their assets, which I'm always fine with, except when it's Windows. That's the only thing. Like I'm happy to use your machine. I don't really mind what hardware it is, as long as like, oh, can you just give me another? And I'm actually like, and I hate to say this, but I'm really at this point now that I've recently tried again to kind of use Windows 11 and actually get back into using Windows and being just more comfortable with it. And I'm just like, no, I would literally rather use Ubuntu. Right. If I couldn't use my Mac, I'd rather use some flavor of Linux than use Windows. And it hurts. It breaks my heart to say that, right? And I'm sure there's so many people listening to this now going, "What are you talking about? This is supposed to be a Microsoft aligned podcast, and you're talking about using Ubuntu." And I'm like, I get it. Like, I love all the Microsoft stuff. Windows just is. I don't know. We have a love-hate relationship, I guess, is the thing. So. Good point, though, Nick. I think that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Chris. Please.
No, I'm done. That's it.
I was just going to mention that another thing that's important to consider in this incident response thing is what I've seen a lot of, unfortunately, is that the security tools that the security team is using may be authenticating or hosted on the same infrastructure, like Active Directory infrastructure, that may be the subject of a breach, right? So as an example, I'll tell you that as an attacker in that position, I've been in a place where I can literally just say, oh, weird. So like people in this group have access to this tool that's like triggering the alerts about what I'm doing. So I could just potentially lock them out of that tool. Or I can give myself an account and watch what they're doing and what they've found about me. And I'll tell you that happens super duper often. So a good example of this is, speaking of Microsoft, Sentinel released a really cool feature where when there's an incident, you can start a Teams channel with like whoever you think you need to engage in order to like support responding to that incident that's been detected by Microsoft Sentinel. I've been an attacker, and we have seen attackers who have access to Teams, who have access to Azure AD, and can just grant themselves access to your incident command room. I've literally dialed into an incident response bridge where people were trying to respond to the incident that I was causing, and people paused and were like, "Hey, who just joined?" And 30 seconds later, everybody just started talking again because it was an awkward pause and I didn't answer, and they just assumed it was fine. So like I think when it comes to incident response, you have to consider like, hey, yeah, maybe I want to use Teams. Is that the best place to have this discussion? Could the attacker have access to Teams? Could they be dialed into my WebEx bridge? So it's
that is the story of the episode for sure. That who just joined.
I have to tell you though, Chris, I saw this being documented a bunch of times on the Microsoft security blog, and they talked about how attackers join incident response calls to either gain more information on how the security organization responds, or how the organization responds to security incident, or to join and ridicule the responders, and so it's like, wow, you know, when you've got that going on, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, wow.
I'll wrap it up with the IR part, which is also another thing that's probably really important, is knowing what tools you have and knowing who knows how to use them, and making sure that people know how to use them appropriately. I'll give you another really good story. This wasn't me personally, but it was a colleague. There was an engagement where we had accomplished our objective, and the client was like, "We didn't detect anything. Can you turn the heat up? Can you just like start getting progressively louder until like my team responds and identifies it?" Which is interesting. Like, at what threshold will you actually catch me? And it got to the point where my colleague was on a security person's laptop, like popping up boxes, like literally diagrams, or like dialogues, and this responder was like just moving them out of the way as they were like frantically Googling how to use the tools that they had in order to respond to this. So something that's really important too is when you're in the middle of an engagement, or like in the middle of an incident response kind of scenario, you need to know that your people or the company that you've hired know how to use your tools, and aren't going to be like frantically Googling how to do XYZ in the middle of that potential issue. I'll also tell you that in the scenario where the like security person was literally having dialogues pop up in their computer, and they were just like moving them away, this tunnel vision problem is something that is very, very real during a high pressure incident response type scenario where people are just so tunnel visioned that they will literally ignore a pop-up that says, I'm on your computer watching you, because they're just trying to get to like Google and like frantically figure it out.
Wow.
So I think it's another thing that I would recommend is kind of have somebody who's responsible for just coordinating and is kind of understanding what people are focusing on and are saying like, hey, I saw this really weird thing on your computer or on this server. Who is available to go look at that? With it can't be just like the one person can't be the only person responding. There should be an incident commander who's responsible for guiding and directing who's doing what, so that tunnel vision is not a huge problem for an individual person. And then another thing that I'll mention is that you need an incident commander who's not actually doing the technical response in the incident. They need to be the people communicating with the executives, with the PR people who are communicating with potentially your internal users. So this like high pressure scenario, I'm literally going to ignore pop-ups on my computer. It sounds ridiculous, and it sounds like I'm making fun of the responder. I'm not. It's just the reality of the situation where if you've never been through one of these before, you're probably going to respond badly. So even if you have a really well prepared security team, if they've never gone through an incident, they're probably going to respond inappropriately. Not because they're bad at their job, not because they're not well trained enough. It's just because you're in the middle of an incident and things are going to happen, and you're going to get 1,000 rapid fire questions from your technical leadership and your exec leadership. It's probably better to have a firm who's done this before, who can come in with a calm pair of eyes and say, okay, I can help you respond. Don't freak out. Don't ignore the pop-ups on your computer. Don't ignore the person who joined the bridge. That kind of somebody who's just been through this a lot and can respond calmly and appropriately is really important.
I think that's a really good sort of bit of advice to kind of wrap up the show. I think a lot of that will come from practice too, right? So running those tabletop exercises, having that rapid fire, I think is helpful. And sometimes those tabletop exercises can get really interesting as well. So yeah, I think that's a really good way to sort of try and get as prepared as possible. Fran, before we let you go, is there anything that you would like to plug, or is there any cool new a research paper or anything like that you've been involved with that you'd like to get some eyes on, or anything like that?
I'd love to say that there was, but unfortunately my job is to manage the people who do the cool work. I just sit jealously on the side doing budget stuff. I would just say my Twitter is on the screen. It's FRANCISCKRS, Franciscers. Ridiculous name, I know. And if you ever have any questions about this, I'm not here to plug the company I work for. I'm happy to help you and give you advice. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I love talking about this stuff and would love to get questions or people reaching out for advice. That's all I got.
That's excellent. And we really appreciate you coming on and kind of having a fun chat with us. It's always great to have you, and hopefully we can have you on again.
Thank you very much for having me. This is always a blast. I really appreciate it, Chris and Nick. Hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks,
and
Brian.
Happy Thanksgiving, I guess, to all the American listeners, but probably by the time you listen to this, Thanksgiving will have passed by a few weeks, but
And the
at least-
turkey would have been digested.
exactly.
I
Maybe,
hope it was
but
delicious.
Yes, happy Thanksgiving to you, Fran. Thank you for joining us.